Everybody, today I, Sahil Kandhari, studying BCOM Honours in Shahid Bhagat Singh College of Section A, I'm going to tell you about the offences and penalties in GST Act 2017. So let's begin with it. So, to begin with, the offences and penalties are covered under Section 122 to Section 138 in the Goods and Services Tax Act 2017. Let's have an overview of what all we will be covering in this presentation today. Offences under Section 122 subsection 1, penalties, general discipline to be followed while imposing a penalties under GST Act. Offence. In general terms, offence is referred to as a law or a rule. It is an illegal act which is punishable under law. Similarly, an offence under GST is a breach of the provisions of GST Act and GST rules. There are 21 offences under GST Act. An offence can also be categorized as a person breaking a traffic signal or doing something which is not allowed to do by the law. Offences under Section 122 subsection 1. There are in total 21 offences which we will cover today. So to begin with, first, a person supplying any good or services or both without issue of any invoice or issues an incorrect or false invoice with regard to any such supply, which means a person who is supplying the goods and services but is not issuing a supply, he's selling goods without the bill, without the GST number, it's a punishable offence. Second, issues any invoice or a bill without supply of goods or services or both is violation of the provisions of this Act. Third, a person collects any tax in contravention of the provisions of the Act but fails to pay the same to the government beyond a period of 3 months from the date on which such payment becomes due. So this means a person has collected tax according to the provisions but has failed to pay to the government because the tax belongs to the government and not to the person, and the government has given a time limit of 3 months and the person has not paid it within the 3 months, so it becomes a punishable offence. Fourth, a person collects any amount as a tax but fails to pay the same to the government beyond a period of 3 months. Let's move on. Fifth, a person fails to deduct the tax in accordance with the provisions of Section 51 subsection 1 or deducts an amount which is less than the amount required to be deducted, or where he fails to pay to the government the amount deducted as tax. So the sixth one, a person fails to collect tax in accordance with the provisions of Section 52 subsection 1 or collects an amount which is less than the amount required to be collected, or where he fails to pay to the government the amount collected as a tax. So there is a difference between the fifth and the sixth offence. The fifth offence says the person fails to deduct the tax. Here the person is deducting the tax on his behalf, and in sixth, a person fails to collect the tax on behalf of the government. So both of these have a different meaning. Seventh offence, a person takes or utilizes input tax credit without actual receipt of goods or services or both, either fully or partially. This means a person utilizes the input tax credit, he takes a receipt without an actual receipt of goods. He does not buy any goods or services, but he takes an invoice for the purpose of utilizing the input tax credit and gaining. So this is a punishable offence. Number 8, a person fraudulently obtains a refund of tax under this Act. A person has not made a sale or a purchase and has not made a revenue but is obtaining a refund for the tax under this Act. Ninth offence, a person takes or distributes input tax credit by an input service distributor in contravention of Section 20. 10th, a person falsifies or substitutes financial records or produces fake accounts or documents or furnishes any false information or return with an intention to evade payment of tax due under this Act, which means a person forges his financial accounts, forges his financial information just to evade the tax, just for the purpose of evasion of tax. Number 11th, failure to register despite being liable to pay tax. This means a person who is liable to pay tax under the GST provisions but has not registered himself with the GST portal. So this makes a punishable offense. Number 12, a person furnishes any false information with regard to registration particulars either at the time of applying for registration or subsequently. This means a person is giving false information about himself, about his company for the purpose of registration, or he might be giving false information subsequently in the later stages. Number 13, a person obstructs or prevents any officer in discharge of his duties under this act. This means a person a person is obstructing a commanding officer who's come to check his books, or who has the right by the law, by the governing authority to check, but the person is obstructing and not allowing the officer to discharge his duties. He's doing a punishable offense. Number 14th, a person who transports any taxable goods without the cover of documents. This is an interesting point. We will come back to it later in our presentation. Number 15th, a person suppresses his turnover leading to evasion of a tax. This means a person is either undershowing his revenue or overshowing his expenses just to suppress his turnover, and which leads to suppression of his net profit, and this leads to suppression of gross profit, and this leads to evasion of tax. So this is also a punishable offense. Number 16, a person fails to keep, maintain or retain books of accounts and other documents in accordance with provision of the act. Number 17th, a person fails to furnish information or documents called for by an officer in accordance with provisions of this act, or furnishes false information or documents during any proceedings under this act. So this means if a person is under any proceedings according to this act, and if the commanding officer asks for the documents and the books, and if a person fails to furnish that information, he's bound to pay a penalty and is committing an offense. Let's move on. So number 18, a person transports any goods which he has reasons to believe are liable to confiscation under this act. This means a person who's transporting or storing any illegal goods or service in any illegal goods which is not allowed is liable for to confiscate under this act. Number 19th, a person issues any invoice or documents by using the registered number of another registered person. So this offense means a person who's trading under some company's name, but he's using any other person's GST identification number for the purpose of issuing invoices. He's committing a crime. Number 20, a person tampers with or destroys any material evidence or document relating to his business and daily workings. Number 21, a person disposes of or tampers with any goods that have been detained, seized or attached under this act. This means a person cannot tamper with any goods which has been detained or seized by the authority under this act. So with this we cover all our 21 offenses that have been mentioned in the GST Act 2017. So now guys, let's come on to the penalty side. The word penalty can be defined as a temporary punishment or a sum of money imposed by a statutory authority to be paid as a punishment for the commission of a certain offense. Second, a punishment imposed by a law or contract for doing or failing to do something that was the duty of a party to do. This means if a person has been given certain work, has been given a certain contract, but the person fails to perform or fulfill the contract, so he is liable to a penalty. A penalty can be both corporal or pecuniary, civil or criminal. So in GST, both corporal, that is jail, and pecuniary, that is monetary penalties, are applicable. So let's come on to general discipline to be followed while Penalizing a person. Such general discipline is enshrined in Section 126 of the GST Act. So, to begin with, no penalty is to be imposed without issuance of a show cause notice and proper hearing in that matter, affording an opportunity to the person proceeding against to rebut the allegations leveled against him. This means no penalty can be imposed on a person until and unless he is given the right and authority to defend himself for the allegations that have been imposed on him by the officer. Second, the penalty is to depend on the totality of the facts and circumstances of the case. This means the penalty cannot be just put according to the wishes of the commanding officer, but rather based on the totality of the facts and circumstances of that case, particular case. Third, the penalty imposed is to be commensurate with the degree and severity of breach of the provisions of the law or the rules alleged. This means any offense committed has a subsequent penalty that has to be imposed on the person. So the penalty cannot be just imposed randomly, but has to be according to the rules of the GST Act. Number 4, the nature of the breach is to be specified clearly in the order imposing the penalty. Number 5, the provisions of the law under which the penalty has been imposed is to be specified. So, in total, while a commanding officer imposes a penalty on a person, he has to mention the provisions of the law under which he is penalizing the person and the nature of the breach that the person has committed for which he is being penalized. Let's move on. The penalty provided for in GST Act. For the offences mentioned in Section 122, subsection 1, penalty shall be higher of the following amount. These are the offences which we discussed right now, the 21 offences that have been mentioned in Section 122, subsection 1. So, the penalty has to be higher of the following. First, the amount of tax evaded, fraudulently obtained as refund, availed as credit, or not deducted or collected, or short deducted or short collected. Second, a sum of rupees 10,000. This means either the whole amount of tax that is evaded has to be paid back, or a sum of rupees 10,000, either of which is higher. Further, Section 122, subsection 2 provides that any registered person who has not paid tax or makes a short payment of tax on supplies shall be liable to a penalty which will be higher of the following. First, for reasons other than the fraud or wilful misrepresentation or suppression of the act, he has to bear a 10% of the tax not paid or short paid, or rupees 10,000, whichever is higher. In case there is a reason of fraud or wilful misrepresentation or suppression of facts willfully, the amount of tax has to be the amount of penalty has to be equal to the tax due from such person, or rupees 10,000, whichever is higher. So I hope everybody is clear till here. Let's move on. Further, Section 126 specifies that in particular, no substantial penalty is to be imposed for, first, any minor breach such as violation of the provisions in a case where the tax involved is less than 5,000, or a procedural requirement of the law, or an easily rectifiable mistake, omission in documents that has been made without fraudulent intent or gross negligence. This means no substantial penalty can be imposed on a person if the mistake in his documents is rectifiable, or the omission has not been done with the intent of fraudulent intent. Let's move on. So now let's come on to the penalty for a person other than a taxable person. Section 122, subsection 3 provides for levy of penalty extending to rupees 25,000 for any person who, first, aids or abets any of the 21 offences under Section 122, subsection 1. Second, deals in receiving, supplying, storing, transporting goods that are liable to confiscation. Third, knowingly receives or deals with supply of services in contravention of the Act. Fourth, fails to appear before an authority who has issued a summons. Fifth, fails to issue any invoice for a supply or account for any invoice in his books of accounts. So a penalty can be imposed other than a taxable person if he's committing any of the 21 offenses, or he's promoting, or he's making somebody else do the same, and the rest of the points. So let's move on. The penalty imposed under CGST Act on transporters. This is a very interesting case. So we discussed it. We came with up in our presentation earlier. So let's begin. In this case, if any person transports any goods or stores any such goods while in transit without the documents prescribed under the Act, that is, invoice, e-way bill, or a declaration, or supplies or stores any goods that have not been recorded in the books of accounts maintained by him, or in the contravention of any of the provisions of the Act, then such goods shall be liable for the detention or seizure along with any vehicle on which they are being transported. So this means if the goods are not in the books, or the person carrying the goods does not have the required documents, the goods will be confiscated along with the vehicle in which they are being taken will be confiscated. So it has two cases. First, where the owner comes forward owing to the responsibility of the goods. Such goods shall be released on payment of the applicable tax and penalty equal to 100% of the tax, or upon furnishing of security equivalent to the said amount. Second, in case of exempted goods, penalty is 2% of the value of goods, or rupees 25,000, whichever is lesser. Second case, where owner does not come forward, such goods shall be released on payment of the applicable tax and penalty equal to 50% of the value of goods, or upon furnishing of security equivalent to the said amount. Second, in case of exempted goods, penalty is 5% of the value of goods, or rupees 25,000, whichever is lesser. So in this case, if the owner comes forward, the goods will be released by paying the applicable tax and the penalty equal to 100% of the tax upon or furnishing any security. And if the owner does not come forward, such goods shall be released on payment of the applicable tax and penalty equal to 50% of the value of goods, not the value of the tax, 50% of the value of goods upon furnishing. So this makes it very costly. And in case of exempted goods as well, if the owner comes forward, it is 2% of the value, or 25,000, whichever is lesser. And if the owner does not come forward, the penalty is 5% of the value of goods, or 25,000, whichever is lesser. So let's move ahead. Common offences under the GST and their penalties. So this is a summary of all the offences and summary of most of the offences and the penalty that has been stated in the GST Act. First, penalty for delay in filing GST returns. Late fee is rupees 100 per day per Act. So it is 100 under CGST and 100 under SGST. Total will be rupees 200 per day. Maximum is rupees 5,000. There is no late fee on IGST. Second, penalty for not filing GST return. Penalty is 10% of the tax due, or rupees 10,000, whichever is higher, not lower, whichever is higher. Third, penalty for committing a fraud. Penalty is 100% of the tax due, or rupees 10,000, whichever is higher. And if it's a high value fraud, it also causes a jail term. Penalty for helping a person to commit fraud. If you are helping somebody to commit fraud, it also has a penalty extending up to rupees 25,000, which depends on the commanding officer. Next, penalty for opting for composition scheme even though he is not eligible. Demand and recovery provisions of section 73 and 74 will apply. If it is a fraud case, penalty 100% of the tax due, or rupees 10,000, whichever is higher. If it is a non-fraud case, penalty 10% of the tax due, or rupees 10,000, whichever is higher. Next, penalty for wrongfully charging GST rate, charging higher rate. Penalty 100% of tax due, or rupees 10,000, whichever is higher, if the additional GST collected is not submitted with the government. Penalty for not issuing invoice. If you do not issue an invoice, there is a penalty of 100% of the tax due, or rupees 10,000, whichever is higher. So do not forget to issue an invoice if you are in the business. Penalty for not registering under GST. If you do not register yourself under GST and you are liable to pay the tax, a penalty of 100% of the tax due, or rupees 10,000, whichever is higher. Penalty for incorrect invoicing. Penalty of rupees 25,000 is levied. Situations where there is no penalty but interest may apply. So the type of offence and the action that is taken. First, penalty for incorrect type of GST charge, IGST instead of CGST or SGST. So there is no penalty. The government says pay the correct GST and get refund for the wrong type of GST paid earlier. Second, paid penalty for incorrect filing of GSTR. Action, no penalty but interest at the rate 18% on shortfall amount. Third, penalty for delay in payment of invoice. ITC, that is input tax credit, will be reversed if not paid within 6 months. There is no penalty as such. Penalty for wrongfully charging GST rate. Charging lower rate. Interest at the rate 18% applicable on the shortfall. Shortfall means the difference between the higher interest rate and the lower rate. So with this, we end our presentation. I would like to thank you so much. I would like to thank you all. I hope you all understood the presentation. If you guys have any doubts, feel free to contact me. Thank you so much.